Hey guys, this is my entry for TJ the Brickwright's latest mock contest, which was about designing a final order shuttle for Emperor Palpatine, as we haven't seen one in episode 9 yet. I'm first going to tell you about the designing process of the ship, and after that I will show you the build more closely. So for those of you who just want to see the build, I added timestamps so you can skip forward. When starting to design the shuttle, I first thought about the already existing shuttles in the Star Wars universe. There's especially one type which appears in almost every movie, and it has this iconic triangular shape created by its 3 wings. There is no generic term for this shuttle type, but I think you know what I mean. We saw them in Service for the Republic. To name a few examples, there was the Ni class shuttles, the Ida class, the Omicron class, and the Theta class. During the time of the Emperor, we also see a few shuttles of this type, the Sentinel and Delta class for example, but also the most known one probably the Lambda class. And later also the First Order used the Xi class shuttle. So in conclusion, you can say that this specific type of shuttle was very popular throughout the whole Skywalker saga at least. Of course, the shuttles were always developed further, but the overall concept never changed. As the First Order's C-Class shuttles are the latest models that we see in use, I figured that the Final Order would probably use a similar looking successor. So my first plan was to make Palpatine's shuttle look something like a C-Class's successor, but then I remembered that during the Clone Wars, Palpatine wasn't using the standard Ni class shuttles. Instead he was flying with a Theta class one, which was only built for him. I imagined that the reason for this is probably that it was easier to design a complete new single ship, specialized only for him, than trying to modify a Ni class shuttle. Also because of its unique and different look back then, it also made his shuttle stand out from all the others. Contrary to that, during the era of the Galactic Empire, you only see him using a standard Lambda class shuttle after his Theta class got outdated. Maybe he also had another special version built, and even if we don't actually see that in the movies, I'm sure there was a reason for this. But overall, I really like the idea of the Emperor using a shuttle that was only built for him, fitting his purposes and equipped with the best and latest tech. This is why I then decided to build a shuttle that wouldn't look like the common shuttle type of the Last Order, which I would imagine to look more boxy and kind of clunky. Regarding the coloring, I also imagined that the Final Order standard version would be mostly colored red with a bit of black, whereas Palpatine's shuttle would be more black in general and only has a few red accents here and there, which let's refer to his personality. So I went with mostly using black coloring, but also added a few red stripes here and on the wings. Overall, the main body is based on the shape of the old Theta class, as I really liked it. There are just some small changes I made. For example, I angled this front part right here to make it look more streamlined, and I also lengthened the hull to have more space inside. But compared to the Theta class, I wanted the shuttle to look much more aggressive, so I decided to also incorporate the forward angled wing design of the Bad Batch shuttle. I originally intended the wings to be much longer than this, but even if I used 5 of those hinges here, they weren't able to hold the weight, so I had to shorten the wings a bit. I also came up with a new cockpit design. It has more edges and an overall boxier look, which fits the First and Last Order's designs. I also added these 2 red markings here, resembling a pair of eyes. And with the front section looking like a beak, the whole shuttle in general is very reminding of some kind of vulture, which also fits Palpatine's character traits very good in my opinion. Now regarding the top wing, I first didn't want the shuttle to have one, because obviously a vulture only has 2 wings, but it didn't look right, and I also imagined it having a reason that all classes following the Ni class had a 3rd wing added, maybe for better stabilization while flying, so that's why I decided to keep the wing on the top. I just didn't want it to be as big as on the Lambda class, and I also tried to integrate it more into the whole shape of the shuttle, therefore I kept the front part in the same angle as the cockpit here. And I also extended the wing so it connects with the back of the ship. Another important thing I wanted to keep is the relatively clean look of the previous shuttles, meaning that there isn't too much greaving and most surfaces are just flat and even. That's why I decided to use the snot technique on most parts of the shuttle, as you can achieve this very well with it. This was very useful, especially on the wings, because it looks very clean on both sides. If I use plates with tiles on top, the bottom wouldn't look that great because there aren't much inverted tiles to choose from. I really wish Lego would release more tiles here, especially inverted and wedged ones. Anyways, I think this was everything important there is to say about the designing process, so I'll now move on to showing you all the details and functions of the ship more closely. Starting with the main armament on the front, there's one very powerful ion cannon and two rapid-firing laser cannons on each side of the ship. I also wanted to include two proton torpedo launchers, but then I remembered that this ship has the purpose of transport and that it doesn't have to be armed to the teeth. Also, you wouldn't have to store high explosive ammunition inside, which reduces the chance of the ship getting blown up drastically. Moving on to the wings, it really was a challenge to prevent them from falling apart. That's why I used this technique of reinforcing by adding technic beams to the structure, and they hold everything together very well. The fins here have no real purpose, I just wanted to add some color to the wings. Down here, these parts are rangefinders and they help with the target acquisition of the main guns. I also included headlights on the bottom here, which could be very useful in Exegol. Now on the sides, I really like how I was able to achieve this rounded shape by using those arc bricks. Here's also a flap that you can open, but this is part of the landing mechanism, which I will show you later on. And here we've got some cooling vents for the engines in the back. If you turn to the back now, you can see the engines here. They look a bit different to the engines you usually see on shuttles of this kind, but I wanted to try something new. And I was inspired by Kylo Ren's TIE Fighter engine, which also had this grating in front. It was very complicated to integrate it here with using slope bricks, but I think it looks alright, even if I'm not 100% satisfied with it. I also didn't want the engine to stick out too much, that's why I moved it more inwards, so it's harder for potential enemies to hit it. A cool technique I used here is that I took white plates and covered them with transparent tiles, and this makes the engine glow much more. Also, I chose to make the engine glow in red because I think it fits the ship's color scheme better than blue, for example. Here there is some greaving, and what of course shouldn't be missing, an anti-pursuit cannon. It can rotate up to almost 100 degrees, and normally it's shooting automatically, but it can also be controlled manually by one of the crew members. Back here it's also very easy to show how using the snotting technique allows you to shape your build in so many new ways. For example, I used these panel tiles here to fill the gap, so I was able to create this very clean looking edge on top of here. Next up, you can remove this section here, and it lets you take a little sneak peek of the interior. In the room you can see here is the Emperor's throne room with all his medical equipment in the background. Now I imagine the shuttle to be basically split in 4 bigger sections. First you have the accessible transport section down in the middle, and then 2 sections next to it only containing technical stuff, with the fuel tanks here in the front, the middle with the landing gears, and the engines in the back. And then the main reactor houses in the 4th section, which is the one on top of the accessible interior. So over here there's another panel to remove, and it shows you a pipe running from the fuel tanks up here to the reactor, which in return is transmitting his energy onto the engines in the back. And this thing right here is an air supply system for the room behind the grills here, where Palpatine's guard sits. Yeah, so this space was still empty at first, but then I had the idea to add this nice little detail, especially because I like to always think about where all the important components would be on a ship. Also, this section is cooling the reactor inside with fresh air, and then the hot air gets blown out on the back. Right here. But this only works in an atmosphere, of course. And there are also some small lights on all 3 wings. So the shuttle silhouette can still be seen in the dark. Moving on to the cockpit, this was the most difficult part of the ship because I had to try out so many techniques until I was finally achieving the shape I wanted it to look like. Especially filling these narrow gaps on the front here was a challenge. The new 2x6 wedge plates that Lego came out with recently were very useful here. Even if there are a lot of studs visible compared to the rest of the shuttle, I still think it turned out great, and it's also very reminiscent of a vulture like I wanted it to. Here I also discovered that these shield tiles can be very useful to bring some more texture into the surface. Of course, there's also an interior. You can just take this assembly off, and this is how the inside of the cockpit looks. There are 2 pilot seats and 2 additional ones for other passengers, like this officer right here. So these are all the control panels. Both pilots have a yoke to steer the ship on their own if something bad should happen. And this right here is a screen that shows them where they are flying. Yeah. And behind that there are all the computing systems and important sensors. Another cool thing I already liked on the Lambda class was the ability to use the cockpit as an escape pod. That's why I also added this feature to this shuttle. You just have to pull on the cockpit and then it will detach. But it's important to note that only the persons with the highest rank are allowed to enter the escape pod. In this case, both pilots and the officer, and of course Palpatine. His guards would bring him into the cockpit and then make sure that he's connected to the medical devices that are installed there. Then they would close the door again, and then they would leave the cockpit and be left to their fate. And after that, both engines on the back here would ignite, and they could land on the nearest planet. But because they move through the unknown regions more often now, there are some extra large fuel tanks in the front section here, in case it takes a longer time to find a suitable place to land on. Now I will move on to showing you the main interior. If you take off this giant top section here, you now have access to the interior section below. And we'll start with the front and slowly move towards the back of the ship. So first up, we've got some machinery here and some pipes running up from the fuel tanks. And over here there is a ramp that leads up to the cockpit. But if someone wants to leave the shuttle through the main entrance now, this ramp is blocking their way out. To solve this problem, you can fold it up and now you have access to the main loading ramp and can go out. Adding a second ramp was an idea that I came up with to solve the problem of the lander class, where the pilots couldn't leave their cockpit while the loading ramp was open, as there was no floor connecting them with the rest of the ship. Later, when the shuttle has landed, I will also show you how the main ramp opens. Next up, this is the room where all 4 of Palpatine's guards have their seats. And these are actually the ones that you see in episode 8 in Snoke's throne room, but I imagine that Palpatine would still have the same guards. I didn't like how the walls looked at first, because they were only in dark gray, so I added these typical lights from the Empire, but changed their color from white to red to fit the final order better, and I think it looks really good. Also, you may have noticed the 2 black lines on the floor. They actually lead from the entrance ramp through the whole ship to Palpatine's throne, kind of like a red carpet. If you move on, there's a weapon rack that stores all 4 weapons of the guards and also 2 additional blasters. And on the opposite side there is a central control station with a guy who is monitoring everything while always keeping contact with both pilots. And he's also able to manually control the ship's weapon system. Now there's only one room left, the Emperor's throne room. I really tried to make his throne look similar to the one on Exegol, with all the rocks behind on the wall there, because it adds a very menacing look to the throne. I also elevated Palpatine's throne by a few plates, so he seems bigger, and if someone comes in to speak with him, they always have to look up and kind of submit themselves to him. As we have seen in episode 9, Palpatine is really dependent on medical life support, so this room is full of medical equipment, otherwise he couldn't travel very far. I built some tanks here, which contain very important fluids for him, so he's connected with tubes to them. Over here there's also a small storage area to store some Sith artifacts or something like this. And this is a holoprojector table. I actually wanted to buy the small hologram figure piece for this, but it costs like €8, so I chose to build it with bricks instead, and it doesn't look too bad, I think. This guy right here is one of Palpatine's sovereign protectors, who was only visible for a few seconds in episode 9. His job is to make sure that everything is alright with Palpatine. Now here on this side, there is also a bacta tank that can be taken out easily when opening this flap. I imagine that Palpatine would use a bacta tank very often, so I included one in this build. And as there's not much space for a normal size bacta tank, I tried to build a smaller one, which fits into this niche. And I was inspired by the tank that Boba Fett is using in his palace here. But there was another problem I had to solve, because Palpatine doesn't seem to be able to walk on his own anymore, or at least not very well, and he's also needing constant medical support. That's why he's attached to this big arm in episode 9 that carries him around, I figured. And this raised the question how he would even enter a shuttle, so I had the idea that he's using a mobile throne with repulsor lifts, like we have already seen Yoda use in episode 2, but I also included a pair of medical fluid tanks, which can support Palpatine for a few hours. This makes him able now to move within smaller distances, even when he's not connected to a medical station. So if he wants to enter a shuttle, his throne would carry him from the main ramp through the hallway, and then it would snap onto the pedestal. And then one of his guards would make sure that he's connected to the main medical station on board. And then they are ready to go. Now I think this was actually everything there is to show on the inside, so I'll now demonstrate how the shuttle lands. But first, you have to fold the wings up. And then you are ready to go. This is something I'm really proud of, because I was able to include a fully retractable landing gear, which took me hours to finally get it working. So first you have to open this flap on this side, and then pull this part out. And then if you turn to the back, you can turn this round piece right here. And then the landing gear will retract on the bottom. And then you put this piece back in and close the flap again, so the landing gear won't get pushed back in by the shuttle's weight when it's landed. I also tried to connect both sets of landing gears mechanically, so you can extend both at the same time, but the torque on the Technic axles connecting them was so high that they wouldn't extend properly. This is why you have to do one after the other. After removing the stand, there are two gaps left on the bottom where the stand attached to the ship's Technic structure. So I included these panels to close the gaps again. And now everything looks clean again on the bottom. So this is how the shuttle is looking when it's landed. It's hard to believe that these two landing gears here can actually hold the entire weight of this shuttle, but it's working. Now if Palpatine arrives and wants to leave his ship again, his throne would detach here and then move all the way through the hallway to the front ramp. Then the smaller ramp would go up, so he now has access to the main ramp. Then the main ramp would open, and then Palpatine could leave his shuttle through the main entrance. But before that, his guards would go outside and check if everything is okay on the outside, if there aren't any threats, for example. Maybe you have also noticed that the ship is leaning backwards a bit, and this wasn't intended at first, but then I noticed that a minifigure could now perfectly pass under the front section of the cockpit, so this wasn't a problem anymore. Now with the cockpit being removed, here's another angle at the front ramp getting opened. I really like how it folds up itself to close this gap on top of here. I also included a flap down here for refueling the ship's fuel tanks, but it's not that easy to access, so I sadly won't be able to show you this. Now this was everything there is to show in the shuttle. It was really a challenge to build this, but in the end I learned a lot of new stuff, and also it's always exciting to see what ideas all the other participants had and how they implemented them. I really want to thank teacher the Brickwright for hosting this contest. He's an awesome guy. I also linked him in the description in case you're interested in seeing more Lego content. I also want to thank all my viewers for the amazing feedback they gave me on my previous videos, because this really motivated me to build more. Now I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'm really interested to know what you think about this MOC. Thanks for watching and see you next time.